In the summer of 1944, American intelligence analysts noticed something in the combat reports that made no sense. Japanese pilots were getting harder to kill. Not across the board, in specific engagements against specific units. The kill ratios were tightening in ways the numbers shouldn't have allowed. Japan had just lost 400 carrier pilots in 3 days. Their training program was collapsing. Their fuel reserves were gone. By every metric, Japanese naval aviation should have been dying. Instead, something inside it was getting sharper. This is the story of how that happened, and why understanding it changes what you think you know about what America actually destroyed at Midway. Here is the detail that matters, and I want you to hold it because everything in this video comes back to it. Japan did not build pilots the way America built pilots. Japan built them the way a master craftsman builds a blade. Slowly, selectively, at enormous cost, one at a time. And like a blade, each one was irreplaceable. Remember that word, irreplaceable. It will tell you everything about what was lost, and everything about what survived. Before June of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy operated the most demanding aviation selection program in the world. The co-pilot training pipeline accepted fewer than 3 applicants in every 100 who attempted it. A candidate who cleared the written examination, survived the physical screening, and passed the psychological evaluation still faced a minimum of 2 years of ground instruction before he was permitted to touch a combat aircraft. The men who completed that pipeline emerged flying at a level that American and British aviators, encountering them for the first time over Pearl Harbor and the Dutch East Indies, described with words they rarely used about enemies. Words like precise, words like unhurried. The numbers reflected it. In the opening months of the Pacific War, the kill ratio in air-to-air combat consistently favored Japanese pilots by margins that American commanders found difficult to put in official reports without appearing to be making excuses. The 0 was part of that. But the 0 was a tool. The tool worked the way it did because of the hands holding it. By the spring of 1942, Japan had between 600 and 700 of those hands, carrier-qualified naval aviators trained to the full CO standard. That number had taken a decade to build. It could not be rebuilt quickly. It could not be rebuilt at all if the losses came fast enough. And at Midway on June 4, 1942, they came fast enough. In 4 minutes of dive bombing, the United States Navy sank 3 Japanese fleet carriers. A 4th followed that afternoon. The pilots aboard those ships, the men who had trained for years, the men whose skill had been the margin in every engagement since December, went into the water with them. Not all of them, but enough. The pipeline had been building toward a number it never reached. Midway cut it in half. What you need to understand is that Midway was not the end of this story. It was the beginning of a different one. The Japanese Navy's response to Midway was to accelerate training. The logic was industrial and, on its face, reasonable. Losses require replacements. Replacements require training. Shorten the training, produce more replacements, close the gap. By 1943, the standard pipeline had been compressed from 2 years to 6 months. By late 1944, some replacement pilots were reaching frontline units with fewer than 100 hours of total flight time. The men they were replacing had arrived with 700. The gap between those two numbers is not a gap in skill. It is a gap in kind. A pilot with 100 hours has learned to fly an aircraft. A pilot with 700 hours, 500 of them in combat conditions, has learned something that no classroom and no training syllabus can teach. He has learned what his aircraft feels like at the edge of its envelope. He has learned to read the geometry of a developing engagement 3 moves before it resolves. He has learned, at a level below conscious thought, when to turn and when to run and when to do neither. That knowledge does not live in the mind. It lives in the hands, and it cannot be transferred. It can only be accumulated, slowly, in conditions that either kill you or make you harder to kill. Japan's accelerated graduates did not have it. They arrived at frontline squadrons knowing how to take off and land and fly level in formation. They did not know how to survive. And in the summer of 1944, the Philippine Sea showed exactly what that meant. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. Japan committed over 400 carrier aircraft in the largest carrier battle of the Pacific War. By the end of the following day, American fighters and anti-aircraft fire had destroyed 92% of them. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name was cruel and accurate. The Japanese replacement pilots flew into combat formations they could not read, against opponents they could not anticipate, executing maneuvers they had practiced in training but never felt under fire. They died in the kind of numbers that stop looking like combat and start looking like arithmetic. And here is the planted flag. Here is what every history of the Philippine Sea correctly records, and almost none of them follow far enough. Among the 400 aircraft Japan lost over 2 days, the accelerated replacements died in the first passes. The veterans, the men trained before the pipeline collapsed, the men with 600 and 700 hours, the men who had survived Midway and the Solomons and everything between, flew differently. They were harder to find, harder to fix in a gun sight, harder to predict. Some of them made it home. Hold that thought, because what happened to those men after the turkey shoot is the center of this story. If you're finding this story shows you something about the Pacific War you haven't seen before, a like helps it reach others who care about this history. The survivors of Japan's carrier aviation elite did not return to carriers. By late 1944, there were almost no carriers left to return to. They were reassigned to land-based interceptor units scattered across the home islands and the remaining outer defense perimeter, to training establishments that needed their knowledge, to roles that the pre-war Navy would never have assigned to men of their qualification. And something happened in those assignments that no one in the Imperial Japanese Navy's planning apparatus had anticipated. Cut loose from the rigid doctrinal framework of carrier aviation, operating in smaller units, without the institutional overhead of fleet structure and formal command hierarchies, these men began to adapt in ways the system had never permitted. They modified their aircraft. They developed interception techniques specific to the B-29's flight profile that existed in no manual because no manual had been written for an enemy that flew at 30,000 feet and could not be reliably reached by standard intercept geometry. They shared knowledge laterally, pilot to pilot, squadron to squadron, at a speed that formal channels could not match. A flight leader named Toshio Ota, based at Atsugi outside Tokyo, developed an upward-firing cannon installation in his interceptor that allowed attack from below the B-29's defensive blind spot, a technique his unit refined through trial and actual combat, not through training. His modification was copied by other units before any official directive acknowledged it existed. The knowledge moved faster than the bureaucracy. This is the mechanism that the American intelligence reports were detecting without being able to name. Not an improvement in the Japanese pilot force overall. That was collapsing, visibly, measurably, in every aggregate statistic. What they were detecting was the behavior of a small number of men who had been freed, by catastrophe, from a system that had also been constraining them. The pre-war training pipeline had produced exceptional pilots. It had also produced pilots trained to fight a specific kind of war. Fleet engagements, coordinated strike packages, carrier doctrine refined over a decade of institutional investment. When that war ended at Midway, the doctrine became a liability. The men experienced enough to have absorbed the fundamentals, but not so institutionally embedded that they couldn't discard the framework. Those men found the collapse of the system created a kind of freedom the system itself had never offered. They became harder to kill precisely because no one, including themselves, could fully predict what they would do next. The American pilots who encountered them in late 1944 and into 1945 noted the difference in their own after-action reports, though they rarely understood its source. The language shifted. Early Pacific War reports described Japanese pilots as skilled but predictable, their maneuvers textbook, their formations disciplined, their tactics identifiable. Late war reports from pilots who survived engagements against the remnant veterans described something different, unpredictable, improvised. The engagement doesn't develop the way the recognition materials say it should. One Navy fighter pilot debriefed after a sweep over Kyushu in late 1944 described an engagement with a single Japanese interceptor that lasted 11 minutes, an eternity in air combat, against an opponent who refused every standard defensive response. The pilot could not be baited into a turn fight. He could not be forced into a position the American had trained to exploit. He broke off when breaking off was correct, extended when extending gave him angle, and used terrain in ways that suggested he had been flying that specific piece of sky long enough to know every ridgeline. The American pilot noted, with a flatness that barely contained something else, that he had expended all his ammunition and the Japanese aircraft was still flying when he turned for home. That pilot was not a product of Japan's accelerated training. He was a product of what happened to the men the accelerated training couldn't replace. But there is a second layer here, a darker one. And this is where the story stops being about skill and starts being about what institutions do when they understand they have already lost. By late 1944, Japan's military leadership had access to the same arithmetic the American analysts had. They could read kill ratios. They could count aircraft production numbers. They understood, at the level where understanding becomes unbearable, that the gap between what Japan could put in the air and what America could replace was not closing. It was widening every month. The remnant veterans were harder to kill, yes. They were also finite. There were not enough of them, and they were dying, and nothing being produced by the collapsed training pipeline was going to replace what they represented. The Kamikaze program, formally organized in October 1944, is remembered as a product of Japanese fanaticism. That reading is too simple and too comfortable. The men who designed the program were not fanatics. They were engineers making a calculation. If a trained pilot in a conventional aircraft could expect to score a hit on an American vessel, perhaps once in 5 sorties, and if trained pilots were now almost entirely gone, then the most efficient use of the undertrained replacements pouring out of the 90-day program was not to put them in dogfights they could not survive. It was to point them at a target and remove the variable of return. The Kamikaze program was not born from an excess of courage. It was born from the recognition that the training system was gone and could not be rebuilt. That the thing Japan had spent a decade constructing, the irreplaceable, hand-forged pilot, the blade made one at a time, was finished, and that what remained could not be made into that, could only be aimed. This is the payoff of the planted flag from the beginning of this video. Irreplaceable. That was the word. The pre-war training system built men who were irreplaceable, and for a decade, that felt like strength. When Midway came, and the Philippine Sea, it revealed itself as the deepest structural flaw in Japan's entire approach to air power. A system that cannot replace what it loses is not a system. It is a wager. Japan had wagered everything on the men the pipeline produced. When those men were gone, there was nothing underneath them. America wagered differently. America built a system that assumed its pilots would die and engineered around that assumption. Shorter pipelines, standardized training, interchangeable parts in the human sense, replacements who were good enough and arrived fast enough that the loss of any individual changed nothing. It was a different philosophy of what a pilot was, not a blade, a component. Both philosophies produced exactly what they promised. Japan produced men of extraordinary individual skill, scarce and irreplaceable. America produced men of sufficient skill, abundant and interchangeable. In a short war, Japan's philosophy wins. In a long one, America's philosophy doesn't just win. It makes the other philosophy irrelevant. The veterans the turkey shoot left behind did not stop fighting. They flew until their aircraft ran out of parts, until the fuel allocations dropped below what a sortie required, until the war ended and the sky over Japan went quiet for the first time in years. One of them was a man named Saburo Sakai. He had 64 confirmed aerial victories. He had been flying combat since the China War. In August of 1942, a rear gunner on a Grumman TBF put a .30 caliber round through his skull above the right eye. He flew his 4 hours back to base, partially blind, partially paralyzed, losing blood, and landed it. He returned to combat in 1944. He flew intercept missions over Iwo Jima. He was still alive when the surrender came. After the war, Sakai did something that the men who sent him to fight would not have anticipated. He became friends with the American pilots he had tried to kill. He corresponded with them. He visited them. He sat in their living rooms and talked about the engagements they had shared from opposite cockpits, the specific mornings over specific pieces of ocean, the decisions that had kept one man alive and sent another into the water. He said in later life that he bore no hatred for the men he had fought, only for the men who had sent boys with 90 hours of flight time into combat and called it a strategy. Saburo Sakai died on September 22, 2000, at the age of 84, at a dinner hosted by the United States Navy in his honor at Atsugi Naval Air Facility, the same airfield where, 56 years earlier, the remnant of Japan's greatest pilots had made their last stands against an enemy their training program had never prepared them to face at those odds. He ate with American naval aviators. He shook their hands. He went home, and he went to sleep, and he did not wake up. The system that made him had been broken before he reached his full height. He flew anyway, for years, in conditions the system had never designed for, against odds it had never modeled. And he survived everything the war put in front of him, every engagement, every kill ratio, every arithmetic the strategists used to describe what should have been impossible. The 90-day pilots did not survive. The system failed them before they ever reached the cockpit. That failure has a name and a date and a set of decisions made by men who understood, at some level, what they were doing when they shortened the pipeline and called the result a replacement. What they produced was not a replacement. What they produced was a sacrifice. And the difference between those two words is the distance between what Japan's air war was supposed to be and what it became. Thank you for staying with this story. If it showed you something about the Pacific War that you hadn't seen before, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of history matters, and it puts the video in front of people who care about getting it right. If you're not subscribed yet, I'd be honored to have you here. I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your country in the comments. And if someone in your family served in the Pacific, on any side, in any capacity, tell us about them. Those men lived inside the numbers this video talks about. They deserve more than a statistic.